flights were being held back from going on a vacation. They had to go to the dentist to get a tooth pulled, and they needed it done immediately. I want a tooth pulled, and I don't want any freezing because I'm in a big hurry, Marjorie said. Just extract the tooth as quickly as possible, and we'll be on our way. The dentist was quite impressed. You're certainly a courageous woman, he said. Which tooth is it? Marjorie turned to her husband, John, and said, show him your tooth, dear. You know, it's the person who is forgiven little who shows little love, according to Jesus. I speak to you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Psychologists often tell us that there are 4 big categories of thinking that hold us back: criticism, fear, guilt, and resentment. So when someone criticizes you inappropriately, how do you react? Do you immediately become defensive? Or does the criticism roll off you like water off a duck's back? What are you afraid of today? You find yourself tense all the time? Are you afraid of losing the approval of others or the approval of someone close to you? Do you lack self-confidence? Or are you confident and happy and comfortable in your own skin? And what about guilt? Do we drag guilt around with us? Do we use guilt on others to try to manipulate them? Are we too rough on ourselves? Do we beat ourselves up for things that we've not done that we could have done if we weren't so busy? Do you hold a job with high expectations that we feel we're not meeting? And what about resentment? Do we hold grudges? Do we keep score cards on others? Or have we learned the wisdom to overlook a fault and cut someone slack? What are you carrying anger about? Did your marriage go sideways? Are you still resentful of that husband, wife, or mistress? Did you lose a job and still not got over it? Are you upset about your parents and what they did to you? What do you carry resentment about? Simon the Pharisee invited Jesus to a meal, and these are public affairs in those days, open to anybody. A prostitute came in with a long reputation. She'd heard that Jesus would be dining with this Pharisee and had brought with her an expensive jar of ointment. She waited behind Jesus, weeping, and her tears fell on his feet. So she knelt down and wiped them away with her hair. And she covered his feet with kisses and then anointed them with ointment. And Simon, who was the host, his critical track began to run. He'd invited Jesus to dine because he thought he might be a prophet. But obviously, Jesus was no prophet because he didn't meet Simon's expectations of what a prophet should be. Are you in a job, perhaps, that's got high expectations, like being a doctor, a dentist, an ambulance driver, a school principal, a teacher, a politician, a judge, or perhaps a pastor? I know as a pastor that people's expectations can be very high. I read of a pastor leaving after 22 years who said that, quotes, being a pastor was like being a dog at a Whistler's convention. She said that she didn't miss the gut-wrenching feeling she got every time someone announced they were leaving the church because their needs weren't being met. So if you're in a high expectation profession, listen up. This little gem of a story from the gospel might be for you. See, there were huge expectations around Jesus, and as far as Simon was concerned, Jesus was not measuring up. Jesus should know who this woman was. Simon knew she was a prostitute, and the fact that she was touching Jesus in an intimate way consternated Simon. Jesus should have refused the touch by saying, "Excuse me, what you're doing is inappropriate. Stop it now." But in Simon's mind, Jesus lets her do this thing intimately in public, no less. Did Jesus not have a sense of shame? Shouldn't he feel guilty? In Simon's mind, perhaps, Jesus liked this intimate touch from a prostitute. So he criticized Jesus in his heart. He didn't say anything. But Jesus was aware. Now, should Jesus just let this go, or should he challenge Simon? Let's ask in terms of this story. How did Jesus deal with negative criticism? Well, first, he got Simon's attention by telling him a story about two debtors, one who owed a lesser amount, another a larger amount, and asked if they were both forgiven their respective debts, which would love the creditor more. Simon doesn't avoid the question, but answers it the right way. The one who was pardoned more, I suppose. What Jesus does next is fascinating. He doesn't stop there. He answers Simon's negative criticism of the woman by affirming her. He affirms and praises this prostitute and her actions. Then he makes a case for Simon's conscience. The prostitute did what Simon should have done, but did not. She washed Jesus' feet. You know, from time to time, all of us make the mistake of Simon. We criticize others for weaknesses that we find in ourselves. You see, people are mirrors to us and our behavior. Frequently, criticism, fear, guilt, and resentment come from blaming others and not taking responsibility ourselves. This was Simon's problem. Jesus' answer to criticism was affirmation. We can learn that from him. If we're on our own case for something that we have done, the problem that is likely holding us back is lack of self-worth. We need to affirm ourselves and others if we're going to end criticism's power over us. Gratitude is the best antidote to criticism. It needs to be genuine. It must affirm the person who's been criticized, whether it's yourself or somebody else. We need to counter negative criticism with affirmation. That is a huge lesson. The second of the big four is fear. Jesus doesn't appear to be afraid of anything or anyone. He doesn't get embarrassed, not tainted by association. His company on the cross was two thieves. His day companions were tax collectors, publicans, and sinners. He didn't fear peer review. How about that? Why is he so free? Well, the Bible says that perfect love casts out fear. And the story Jesus tells is about love, not fear. Jesus isn't afraid of what people might think of him. He sees the woman before him, loves her, and he sees her love. This was a woman who was weeping. And Jesus frames her behavior for Simon with this story. This woman has been forgiven so much, so she's able to love deeply. This is a second incredible lesson. See, the critic in Simon is not able to love himself or anybody else. He's blind to this woman and her tears, sees her only in the role of a prostitute, so he condemns her. Simon is a debtor who needs forgiveness, but as far as he's concerned, he doesn't need help, which puts him in his mind in a position to be able to criticize others freely. I'm all right, Jack. Says what's wrong with you. So Simon has got little love. He's into control, and his critical spirit reveals that. After all, it's his house. He's the host, so he needs to control this situation that's going out of control. You know, the main difference between the woman and Simon is that Simon doesn't get it. He thinks he's fine, that he's in a position to condemn. But the Bible is very clear. if we don't love, says St. Paul, we can't even give our bodies to the flame. It's just going to count for nothing. This woman is grateful, aware, and she knows she's forgiven. And the end product of all that is love. So what's the lesson? Is fear our enemy? Love is an antidote to fear. If we're fearful, we need to affirm ourselves as worthy of being loved. In Jesus' kingdom, the person who has love is the most fearless. Look at this woman in public, kissing a rabbi's feet. There's no fear of the host Simon here. She realized that Jesus values her. That's enough for her. Love conquers all, especially fear. And if we're full of fear today, then we need to simply love and respect ourselves. We don't need to control everything. Let it go. Love is the opposite of control over others. What about the third big holdback? Guilt. The story of the two debtors is about two failures. Both debtors are unable to pay back what they owe. What's the response of the creditor? Could have thrown them in jail, but not in this story. The answer to guilt here is pardon and forgiveness. And the result of that, according to Jesus, is love for the creditor from the debtors. This is a metaphor, then, for the love of God. If anyone could make us feel guilty, it would have to be God. Jesus, in the full story of the two debtors, shows that God forgives, but with this caveat: we are forgiven as we forgive others. That's also in the Lord's Prayer. We're forgiven as we loosen the strands of other people's guilt that we're holding on to. Sometimes we bind ourselves to other people through guilt. Somebody does something that we don't like. Instead of cutting them slack and preserving the friendship, we hold the cords of their guilt. We remind them of previous failures. We keep score. We keep our sense of being offended. How foolish that is when we could be free. The creditor could have held on to the obligation and made both debtors feel guilty. He doesn't do that. He pardons the debt. The result is that one pardoned the most loves the most. Do we really want people to love us? Trade guilt for forgiveness. Give pardon. Receive love. Now for the last one, resentment. Resentment is stuffed down anger. Frequently it's anger buried for a long time. It is very bad for our health. Since we bury resentment deeper, it may take some real work on our part to deal with it. Sometimes we'd rather die than change our patterns, and sometimes we carry to the grave a buried anger that has weakened our immune system. How very sad. What we learn from this story about this woman is that gratitude is the very opposite of resentment. Love always indicates forgiveness. If we're carrying resentment to another person, we're not able to love them at the same time. The creditor could have resented the fact that the two debtors were not able to repay him. Jesus could have resented Simon criticizing him. Jesus could have resented this prostitute touching him. He could have thought it inappropriate, as Simon did. Jesus is not into resentment. Let's know that the person who has little to forgive doesn't have much of an experience of gratitude. After all, we say, well, I was a small debt, so I don't have to be too grateful. But if it's a serious debt, and we're forgiven much, if we're normal at all, then the response is deep gratitude. How do we deal with that resentment that's deep within us? It's best to find a way to forgive. I found a story about a woman whose daughter was shot to death by a teenager. She was in a car. A teenager fired a shot, hit her, and the bullet lodged in her brain, and she died in the hospital. The young man was jailed for 14 years, and the mother of the girl carried resentment at the deepest levels. Her family couldn't get over the killing. And one by one, they died of various ailments until she was left alone. The mother blamed everything on this young man. One day, a letter came telling her that he was going to be released from jail. She was furious. She was white hot mad. She thought about this all the time. She was consumed with resentment. Her pastor talked to her about forgiveness. She didn't want to hear anything about that. She wanted this man to be behind bars for the rest of his life. The pastor was aware of this young man and the release program and told the woman about it and asked whether she could meet with him. She refused, but she couldn't leave the idea alone. So one day she agreed to meet the young man, and they sat down and talked together. She asked him about the circumstance of the shooting, and he told her that he'd shot her daughter by mistake because he didn't even see that she was in the back seat. It was a random shot that took her life, and he was very sorry indeed. Suddenly, this woman decided to let it all go, and she stood up, opened her arms, and forgave that young man. They held each other in an embrace, and they both sobbed. And suddenly, for the first time in 14 years, she was free. And as for the boy, now a man, deep gratitude. He who is forgiven much loves much. The big four I put to you are tyrants that hold us all back. So let's clean house today.